At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a control room thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue watched red lights bloom as the reactor they thought they were shutting down roared to life. Metal groaned, the building heaved, and a blast punched the roof free, hurling massive slabs of steel and concrete into a night sky that began to glow. Fire crews sprinted toward what looked like an ordinary blaze, unaware the black chunks under their boots were burning graphite from the heart of a nuclear core. Someone had hit the shutdown button to save them all, and that was the moment the disaster truly began. Why did the button meant to kill the reactor act like a trigger? The plan had seemed simple on paper, and fatally urgent in practice. Engineers needed to prove that if external power died, the spinning inertia of the turbine could keep coolant water flowing for precious seconds until diesel generators kicked in. The test had been delayed by the grid dispatcher until night, pushing it onto a tired shift at low power, exactly the condition that made this type of reactor most unstable. This was an RBMK, a Soviet graphite-moderated, water-cooled design with a hidden flaw that made it twitchy when the core filled with steam. On April 25, 1986, with maintenance looming, the clock began ticking toward a window no one should have tried to squeeze through. In the small city of Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, children slept with schoolbags packed for the May Day parade, and a bright new Ferris wheel waited for its first riders. Inside Unit 4's control room, shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and reactor engineer Leonid Topchinov worked under the hard gaze of Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. By late evening the reactor had been throttled down, then poisoned by xenon, a fission byproduct that absorbed neutrons and smothered power. To pull the power back up, operators withdrew more control rods than their own rules allowed, and they disabled automatic protections that would have stopped the test on the spot. They were not villains in lab coats, they were men inside a system where deadlines outranked doubts. At 12:28 a.m., power plunged far below the planned level, to a trickle that made the core dangerously unstable. Over the next hour, they fought the reactor like a stubborn engine, more pumps on, more valves open, more rods out, until instruments read a fragile few hundred megawatts of thermal power. The emergency core cooling was isolated, the automatic shutdown suppressed, and the turbine rundown test finally aligned. Outside, the night smelled of wet concrete and spring, with guards leaning on railings under sodium lights, unaware of the storm building meters away. At 1:23 a.m., the test began, and the turbine blade started to coast. In the seconds after 1:23 a.m., steam voids multiplied in the core as water boiled in the channels, and the RBMK's hidden temperament turned deadly. Akimov, seeing the reactor slip, pressed the scram, AZ-5, the big red button that drives every control rod home. Within seconds, the inserted rods, tipped with graphite, displaced water before their neutron-absorbing sections arrived, spiking reactivity at the very place it was already most stressed. A massive power surge ripped through fuel channels, shattering them and blocking coolant flow. Around 1:23 a.m., 2 explosions, seconds apart, tore the core apart and vented its insides to the air. On the roof, tar and cables caught, and inside the open reactor a graphite fire began to feed oxygen like a bellows. The nearest fire brigade rolled in minutes later, led by Lieutenants Volodymyr Pravik and Viktor Kybnak, dragging hoses toward flames that looked ordinary and were anything but. Firefighters picked up what they thought were hot rocks and tossed them aside, receiving invisible burns that went bone deep. Across town, residents stepped onto balconies to watch a distant fire and a strange blue glow, not knowing ionized air can look beautiful when it's deadly. In the control room, Akimov and Topchinov tried to pump water into a reactor that no longer existed, loyal to a fight already lost. By dawn on April 26, ambulances carried the worst-hit plant workers and firefighters to Pripyat's hospital, and then on to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, where specialists in radiation sickness waited. Some sources say only 2 were killed in the initial explosions, while others report higher figures that folded early radiation deaths into the chaos, but the hours that followed wrote a clearer tally. Over the next days and weeks, 28 men, operators and first responders, died of acute radiation syndrome, their marrow and organs failing despite every effort to save them. One of them was the young firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, whose wife saw a healthy man turn unrecognizable in days, a private grief multiplied across dozens of families. In Pripyat, buses were assembled through the night of April 26, but no one told the city to leave until the afternoon of April 27, about 36 hours after the explosion. Loudspeakers told people to pack for 3 days, papers, some clothes, a little food, and to leave pets behind. They locked doors and boarded buses under a high sun, looking back at laundry on balconies that would hang there for decades. At the plant, helicopters began dumping sand, boron, clay, dolomite, and lead into the wreck to smother the fire, a rolling airlift that lasted days and strained pilots' nerves and stomachs. A team of plant workers went into flooded corridors to open valves and drain water to prevent a feared steam explosion, a mission long told as suicidal and later debated in its exact danger, but still a descent into the dark for the men who did it. Hundreds of miners from the Donbass and Tula dug a tunnel under the core to install a cooling system that was never used, their sweat mixing with graphite dust in claustrophobic heat. On April 28, alarms at Sweden's Forsmark nuclear plant caught radiation on the shoes of workers arriving for their shift, and the mystery plume was traced back toward the Soviet Union. That evening, the first terse announcement appeared on Soviet television, a day after families in Pripyat had already fled. In Kiev, the May Day parade still marched, while invisible radionuclides drifted overhead and Geiger counters chattered in laboratories. The International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna asked questions, and in August 1986, a gaunt chemist named Valery Legasov faced the room to explain what his country had done and what their reactor had hidden. He told them of a design that could run away at low power, and of control rods that turned a shutdown into a spark. Here is the terrible answer to the opening question. The AZ-5 button did what it was designed to do, insert all control rods at once, but on the RBMK that night, the rod's graphite tips displaced neutron-absorbing water with neutron-moderating graphite at the bottom of the core, briefly increasing reactivity where steam bubbles had already made the reactor too hot to handle. Combined with a high positive void coefficient at low power, disabled safety systems, and a rushed test, the scram amplified the surge instead of quenching it. The system was balanced on a pin and designed to fall the wrong way, and the people inside it had been trained to trust the pin more than their fear. The IAEA would later call it a chain of design flaws, procedural violations, and an absence of a safety culture as it is known today. The human build did not end with the funerals of 1986. In Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, thousands of children later developed thyroid cancers linked to iodine-131 exposure, with at least 15 confirmed deaths from thyroid cancer and many more lives changed by surgery and medication. Long-term mortality from the fallout is debated, with credible estimates ranging from around 4,000 to as many as 16,000 additional deaths over decades, a number spread thin across time and diagnosis codes. The land itself was given a boundary, a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, about 2,634 square kilometers of forests, farms, and villages, emptied and patrolled. Wildlife crept back into spaces where people used to be, while crews in respirators scraped, washed, and buried a poisoned city. The sarcophagus, a concrete and steel shell, was thrown over the ruined reactor by November 1986, a hurried bandage that leaked and aged as the years did. Unit 3 kept running next door until 2000, a surreal fact that says more about energy politics than about comfort with risk. Reactor 1 had been shut in 1996, Reactor 2 after a 1991 fire, and then at last the plant went quiet, though never truly safe. In 2016, a gleaming arch called the New Safe Confinement slid into place over the sarcophagus, sealing the wreck more completely and buying a century of time to dismantle what remains. Time, in Chernobyl, is the only currency that ever mattered. Valery Legasov returned from Vienna a reluctant hero, then fought a losing battle with his own conscience and his country's denial. The day after the second anniversary, on April 27, 1988, he took his own life, leaving behind recordings that criticized the reactor's design and the system that hid its faults. His end was not the only private cost paid in quiet rooms, but it stands as a ledger entry you cannot erase. Even now, inside the zone, the red forest still holds patches of dead pines from that first radioactive blast, and the pavement remembers the weight of decontamination crews and their shovels. In Pripyat's empty apartments, calendars still hang on April 1986, and the Ferris wheel that never officially opened rusts against a sky that forgets nothing. Stand there with a dosimeter and you can hear it, the thin electric chatter of decay that began in a single, fateful second when a button did the opposite of what it promised. The secret of that second, design, pressure, and human habit all aligned the wrong way, exploded a reactor and then wrote a silence across an entire city. And that is the image that remains, a blank hospital bed, a locked door, a sealed arch over a broken core, and a clock that will not stop ticking for centuries.